Welcome to the Online Ethics Center Spring Webinar Series, bringing ethics into the conversation. Today we have with us Dr. Stephen Starrett and Dr. Carlos Bertha, who both work to reform the American Society of Engineers Code of Ethics. Dr. Starrett, the Dean of Engineering and Engineering Technology at LeTourneau University, obtained his BS in Civil Engineering from Missouri University of Science and Technology, later receiving an MS and PhD in Civil Engineering from Iowa State University. He is a licensed professional engineer in Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas, and previously served as the ASCE Environmental and Water Resources Institute president in 2017. Welcome, Dr. Starrett.
Thank you.
Dr. Carlos Bertha, professor of philosophy at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado, received a BS in mechanical engineering from the University of South Florida, later returning to study philosophy. He teaches ethics, analytic philosophy, symbolic logic, and philosophy of science. Dr. Bertha recently retired from the U.S. Army Reserve, achieving the rank of colonel. And welcome, Dr. Bertha.
Thank you.
Thank you both for being with us. I'm Rosalind Byrne, Director of the Online Ethics Center and Professor of Science, Technology, and Society in UVA's Department of Engineering and Society. After Dr. Starrett and Bertha have finished their presentations, we will welcome any questions you have.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. We look forward to visiting with you about these transformational changes that have happened in our ASCE Code of Ethics. I've shared our screen. Dr. Bertha, can you see that? Okay.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
All right, excellent. So Dr. Bertha and I are going to team up on this presentation. We share the content together, and so we look forward to discussing the new ASCE Code of Ethics. Dr. Byrne did an excellent job of introducing us. So Dr. Bertha, do you want to get us started?
Yes, sure. So thank you very much for having us. One of the first things I want to say that with this presentation, you're going to get a little bit of variety, because you're going to have, from my perspective, I teach philosophy, I teach ethics. And so I'm going to be covering a little bit more of the theoretical ethics side of things. Dr. Starrett teaches engineering. He's very well versed in the moral theory, but he's going to cover more of the slightly the engineering side of things. So what you see with us is something's a unique combination of trying to bridge the theory with the practice. So that's where we're going to get started, is to try to do that. Now, the first question I think is valid to ask is, why have a code of ethics at all? I mean, what's the value of having a code of ethics? And I think that the primary answer to that is that codes of ethics do a good job at communicating what various professions are interested in, what various professions value. And so from my perspective, when I teach philosophy, when I teach ethics, I'm teaching it from a moral theory perspective. And sometimes there's kind of a disconnect between the way that we teach these things in a theoretical fashion and trying to connect it to the actual practice of professionals. And so that idea of trying to bridge that gap between the theory and the practice is what I call the middle theory. And so I think that the code of ethics can be very useful in bridging that gap between the theory and the practice. I also think that it could help engineers debate solutions to a situation. Suppose two engineers are arguing about what to do. One of them might say, well, let's crack open the code of ethics to see if it gives us any guidance as to how to proceed. And then lastly, even though the language of the new code of ethics was changed to make it a little more positive, there's still a number of things that it tells us not to do. And so it might help curb some unacceptable behavior. All right, so what you see in front of you is kind of the way I teach ethics. When I teach ethics from a philosophical perspective, I lean on the three major normative moral theories. So these normative moral theories are the ones that purport to give you a correct answer, the right way to do things, or the right way to live. And so that's what you see around the triangle. Now, a number of you might be instructors or professors at academic institutions, and so you might either have access to a philosophy department that does that. Maybe you're in the philosophy department, or maybe you are part of a Christian university, or a religious university, in which case you would also teach it from the perspective of religion-based. Now, in this slide, what you see in the top with bolded black letters is what the ordinary name that we give to that moral theory. Right underneath it, still in black, you see what philosophers call it. And so normally we would call something a principle-based theory. Philosophers would call it a deontological ethics, from the word deontos, which means duty. Underneath that, you see kind of a primary component or proponent of that theory in blue, and then underneath that, sort of a major concept or key component of that of that theory. Now, it's interesting when the previous groups of folks that we have entertained with this presentation so far have been either students of student chapters of ASCE who are just now getting started with their education and understanding what ASCE is and why they have a code of ethics and so on, or we have pitched it to members of ASCE in various chapters around the country and around the world. And so they are on the other end of the spectrum, these very seasoned engineers who've done engineering all their lives. In this case, we have a slightly different kind of audience. It's a more pedagogically inclined audience. And so we're going to try to mold our remarks to fit that as well. And so I'm going to go very quickly through these moral theories. So the major three moral theories that I cover in my ethics class are character-based, principle-based, and consequent-based. Character-based is at the top of the triangle, and it reflects basically this general Greek philosophy that was interested in the kind of life that you live. What are the virtues of a good person? And so if we were to think about this in terms of engineering ethics, then the question would be something along the lines of, what are good virtues for engineers to have? What is important for an engineer to have in terms of the way they live and the way that they carry their character in their lives? Now, the other two, as opposed to the Greek philosophy who was interested in the kind of life we live, the other two are more interested in the sort of decisions that we make. They're more sort of localized in terms of the decision making. And so there you have a tug between the Kantian or the principle-based position that says what matters is the rule that you're following, the governing principle that you're following, versus the more consequentialist view, where what you're interested in is the kind of results that you get from your action. And so those are the three normative theories that I teach in class. And again, the vast majority of the world is a member of a faith community, so we would be remiss not to bring in how that would play a part in this equation as well.
We're going to briefly summarize the code of ethics that was in place prior to this transformational change. It had been pretty consistent for about 43 years, from 77 to 2020. You can trace back our ASCE Code of Ethics back to the predecessor of ASCE, the Boston Society of Civil Engineers. Concepts came from Europe prior to that. And so we've long had a code of ethics for engineers. Just to summarize, it was in 8 canons. You'll notice that the new code of ethics is totally different. We'll talk about that, and it is just a totally different format and a way to approach a code of ethics. So previously, the canon stated hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. That is a long-standing concept. It's of most importance. You'll see that same language very similar in the new code of ethics. One aspect that did change during this 43-year period was the addition of sustainable development. That started about 20 years ago or so, and it was added in for civil engineers to consider. Canon number 2, being sure to work in the areas that we're skilled in. Canon number 3 was be sure to be truthful. Canon number 4, act as a faithful agent. That is a very long-standing language. You'll see some of that carried over into the new Code of Ethics. Canon 5, shall not compete unfairly. Canon 6 there was kind of a catch-all canon to uphold the honor of our engineering profession. About 15 years ago or so, there was really a big push for anti-corruption around the globe. And some of our ASCE leaders were involved with the global efforts. They brought that back to ASCE and really championed this zero tolerance for bribery and corruption being added in to our Code of Ethics. Item 7 there represents the importance of staying current. And then canon number 8 was, I think, the most substantial change to our previous Code of Ethics. It was added as its own canon, number 8, and it was added in 2017, so pretty recently. It was a paragraph in length, but just to summarize it, it was focused on to treat fairly all persons. So there was a desire by President Kemper back in 2016-ish to update our Code of Ethics, to start from scratch and see how we could best modernize it, how we could move some of the language from shall not language to more of a positive, aspirational type language for it to be better utilized in education and in practice. And so when President Kemper was elected, she formed a committee. This committee was about 8 to 10 members, and it was chaired by Dr. Brock Berry. He's a professor at West Point. And so there was the core committee, and then there was a group of about 50 experts or so that were able to interact with the committee often and to engage with the conversations they were thinking of and the concepts that they were speaking about. And so they would send us notes and get our feedback. And so Dr. Bertha and I was in that circle of about 50 experts that had close access to the committee. And then there was another layer of about 500 ASCE leaders that maybe once or twice a year, they would get an update. They would be able to provide input into the committee. And then there were town hall meetings for all of ASCE, which is about 140,000 members, considering the students and all. And so there was at least 2 of those, and they received thousands of comments through these town hall meetings and these other layers of communications that they had. They reviewed every single comment. They spent thousands of hours on this effort. They thought they were going to be able to accomplish it in 1 year of very hard work. It took 2 complete years. Their first drafts were very extensive, as you can imagine. I don't remember the size exactly, but I feel like it was like a 20-page document of the Code of Ethics and good reasons behind all of them. The board of direction just felt like that was way too long, way too big. It just had to be reduced by 10 times to be a lot more valuable. So tons of work, really an extensive process that was utilized. And I can't think of any sort of way that it could have been improved as far as the process that was used.
All right, so the new Code of Ethics was passed by the Board of Direction in October of last year, and it was not unanimous. There was one person who thought we didn't have to change it, but 15 prevailed, and so that's what passed. And the first thing that you see is a preamble. In the preamble functions to introduce what they call fundamental principles. And so this preamble is very Kantian, very principle-based, because it lists the fundamental principles that ought to govern our profession. Now, at this point, these fundamental principles are aspirational. They're rather broad in nature, but they're aspirational, saying that these are the things that matter to our profession. And you see it there: create safe, resilient, and sustainable infrastructure. So the language of sustainable development will come up again in a future part of the code. But you see number 2 there, treat all persons with respect, dignity, and fairness. That language was the one that was introduced in 2017 in the previous code of ethics. And as Dr. Starrett said, that was really the most substantive thing that was done to the previous code of ethics. Well, it survives here as a fundamental principle. Consider current and anticipated needs of society. So here we get a little bit of that more consequentialist idea of we have to look for what the impacts of our profession might be. And then this idea of utilizing our knowledge and skills to enhance the quality of life of humanity. So you're not interested only in the amount of good that we do, but the quality as well. Okay, next slide. And so the preamble continues by introducing the rest of the code. And by doing that, what they're saying is, okay, we're going to introduce the code by way of 5 stakeholders, is what they call it. And so as you see, that's a huge change, because here we went from 8 canons to 5 stakeholders. But it's even more of a change, because the preamble specifies that these stakeholders are listed in order of priority. The previous code of ethics had the 8 canons, and there was no mention about which was more important than which other. It was just not said. Here, it specifically says that these are going to be listed in order of priority. And then it also explains that each one of these stakeholders will have a number of responsibilities, ethical responsibilities, and that those are not in any particular order, except for the very first one. And we'll talk about that one here in a minute. Now, one of the last drafts that was floated around came with a very interesting addition of a footnote. And I'll let Dr. Starrett address that one.
Yes, this was a 24-month extensive process. I would say around month 21 or 22, they were really getting close to the final version. They knew they'd run it by the board of direction a few times, knew they were getting very close. They decided to send it to some legal advisors and counsel for professional societies, ASCE, IEEE, ASME, a variety of different engineering professional societies, to see what their thoughts were about this approach and this particular code of ethics. They also sent it to some legal counsel for some engineering firms. And so they received maybe 20, they might have sent it to about 20 attorneys or lawyers to provide input on. And that group came back with this footnote suggestion. And it states, as you can see there, this code does not establish a standard of care, very legalese type language, standard of care there, nor should it be interpreted as such. And so this was presented to the committee accepted it, and then it went to the board of direction as the final draft. It was debated at the final meeting, but it was accepted into the new code of ethics. Whoops, there we go. As Dr. Bertha mentioned, 5 stakeholders now. Very interesting and totally different than the previous code of ethics. Society or the public, I think those terms are interchangeable. That is the #1 stakeholder and is ranked as the most important. The following ones: the natural and built environment, the engineering profession, clients and employers, and then 5th is peers. This group, I'm sure we could have an awesome debate and discussion about what the order of this should be. So the committee spent a huge amount of time studying this, thinking about it, and this is what they ended up proposing and was what ultimately was approved.
All right, so we get to the first stakeholder. Again, this one was listed as the most important one. There was some debate as to whether society or the environment should be first. There was some disagreement there, but at the end of the day, society or the public won. And then the first one, the first and foremost, protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, is listed there as 1A, the most important one of all. If you were a Star Trek fan, this would be your prime directive. This is the most important thing that we do, the one principle that trumps all others. And so that's again quite Kantian in nature to say this is the principle that we ought to follow. Now, in addition to that, you see the rest of these ethical responsibilities. And they talk about enhancing the quality of life for humanity, being truthful when we express our professional opinions, the language of zero tolerance that was added to the previous code of ethics survives here. This concept of zero tolerance started about maybe 20 years ago or so, where the engineering as a profession was interested in reducing the overall corruption. And so there was a gentleman in ASCE whose name is Bill Henry, who was very instrumental in getting some of this verbiage into the code of ethics. At the time when he proposed the zero tolerance language, there were some people who pushed back and said that zero tolerance just sounds weird, and they didn't like it. And so Mr. Henry's response was, okay, if not zero, then give me a number. What is an acceptable amount of bribery that we were willing to put up with? And it became very clear that there is no other number to use than zero tolerance. Continuing on, we have this idea that we ought to endeavor to be of service in civic affairs, so be part of civil society. Again, the language of treating people with respect, dignity, and fairness survives here. Remember, it was listed also as a fundamental principle in the preamble, but it's listed here also as a ethical responsibility under society. But it's expanded a little bit in the next one when it talks about acknowledging the diverse historical, social, and cultural needs of the community. And so we are to think about their dignity and fairness and all that stuff, but also think about how they're situated in the society that they belong to take in consideration their historical backgrounds, the societal backgrounds, cultural needs of the society. Okay, next slide. So then we have another one that's, this one's new, the idea of considering the capabilities, limitations, and implications of emerging technologies. So this one is encouraging us to look forward, think about the impacts of technologies that are coming up. So sometimes we don't have a clear picture of what those impacts will be. Well, this encourages us to be thoughtful about those results of the emerging technologies. And then this last one, it's very interesting because it talks to us in terms of having the courage to call misconduct out. And so in this one, it encourages us to report misconduct to appropriate authorities, especially when it violates 1A, when it doesn't protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Okay, next slide. And so this second one, natural and built environment, again, there was some discussion about whether this should be more important in society. But what you see in this one is the language from the sustainable development arena. So what we have here, when I started to get into engineering ethics, there was a talk about trying to expand our bottom line. And so the language of sustainable development was instilled to try to think about our profession as being not just one of profit, like a profitable business, but also one that was interested in maintaining equity in society, or improving equity around society, and also being a good steward of our environment. And so this is what at the time was called the triple bottom line, where we would be cognizant of our work in terms of how it affects society and the environment. And so that's what you see reflected in this second stakeholder.
The third stakeholder is the profession. Remember, we had the society and then the environment, and third is the profession. Several catch-all type terms in this. Uphold the honor, integrity, and dignity of our profession. Item B is a brand new concept. The committee did do a crosswalk between all the concepts. They wrote out and determined what all the concepts were in the old Code of Ethics. And then once they'd completed this new development of the Code of Ethics, starting from scratch, They studied to see which concepts that were in the old made it into the new. And from their analysis, they determined that every single concept that was in the old Code of Ethics made it into the new Code of Ethics. And there were 5 additional concepts that were not addressed in the previous Code of Ethics. Item B is one of those, being sure that our work complies with the legal requirements in our area. Item C, being sure to represent truthfully our qualifications and experience. Being sure to reject unfair competition, promoting mentorship and knowledge sharing equitably with current and future engineers. So several of the concepts were reworded to maybe be easier to understand, maybe to communicate a little bit more, maybe to emphasize some different aspects. I do think there are some improvements in how the new Code of Ethics encourages us to think about the next generation of engineers and our role as mentors and educators of the next generations to come. Item F there, being sure to educate the public on the role of civil engineering in society. This is another new concept. ASCE has done an excellent job for probably decades now that they've organized fly-ins to Washington, D.C. That's where civil engineers from every state come to Washington, D.C. and meet with our representatives and congressmen and senators and their staff to discuss the important issues that ASCE is studying and has input on, desires to give input on. So this has been added to our Code of Ethics. Item G there, being sure to continue our professional development, not only in the technical area. I think the emphasis on non-technical aspects has been increased in this new Code of Ethics, and that shows up here in this item G. The 4th stakeholder, clients and employers, being sure to continue as a faithful agent. That's old language that we've had for a very long time. It continues. Item B, being sure to communicate clearly our conflicts of interest, nothing new there. Item C, communicate when risks and limitations are associated with our work. I think item D is related with that as well. C and D are pretty similar. Item D, being sure to present clearly and promptly the consequences to clients and employers when our engineering judgment is overruled. I am aware of many situations that engineers have faced that is focused on this particular concept. They're working on a team. It includes business individuals, marketing, financial aspects, landscapers, architects, just all sorts of different contractors involved on a team. And the engineer feels like the team decision went in a direction that was counter to his or her technical opinion. And then they're faced with an ethical dilemma. So I think this is strengthened as far as what the guidance is that's stated in our Code of Ethics for what the engineer should do in that situation. Continuing on with the 4th stakeholder, old concept, being sure to keep proprietary information confidential. Item F, being sure to work in the areas that we are skilled in. And item G is a long-standing concept, only to seal work and design that we have prepared or that we've had thoroughly reviewed and has been under our responsible charge. Stakeholder 5 is peers. It's the last stakeholder, so they're ranked. So this is the last of the 5 stakeholders. Being sure to take credit for only the work that we complete, providing references for the work of others. Item C is another new concept, foster health and safety in the workplace. My first thought is the construction site. Maybe it's a trench that's been made. There's laborers down in the bottom of the trench working on something that's not shored up properly. The engineer observes it and knows it's a very unsafe work environment. That would be included in this item, but it's very much broader than that. It's very broad. It just talks about health in general. That could be physical health, could be mental health, talks about safety. That's very broad. And then in the workplace could include the construction zone or our office space or our meeting facilities, our travels. So It just is a very broad term, and that was intentional for us to think about improving the safety of our workplace. This comes right alongside with our engineering discipline and manufacturing, where there's been a huge emphasis in safety across America just for the last decade at least. It's really been a high priority. All right, continuing on, item D there, being sure to promote and exhibit inclusive, equitable, and ethical behavior in all of our engagements with colleagues. Item E, acting honestly and fairly on collaborative work. And completing the code of ethics here with these last items, encouraging and enabling the development of others, particularly thinking about the next generation of engineers. Item G, supervising fairly. Item H, commenting only in a professional way when we are criticizing other engineers. And item I is a brand new item. It is to report violations of this code of ethics to the ASCE. They do have a committee that's set up on professional conduct. They receive violations and make determinations if the individual that's been reported has violated the code of ethics or not.
All right, and so there you have it. What you just saw was the actual verbatim code of ethics. We shortened the canons of the previous code of ethics for expediency, but here we thought it would be important to show the exact wording of the current code of ethics of ASCE. So when Dr. Starrett talked about that committee, the central committee, that central committee had 8 engineers and 1 attorney. It did not have a philosopher, and so or an ethicist. So what I think is a valid question, since the word ethics is contained in the concept of code of ethics, to ask an ethicist what they think of the code of ethics. And so that's what I'm going to do in the next few slides, is to sort of make some connections between the various moral theories as I teach them in class in an ethics course, and where it shows up in the code of ethics. So if you recall, the major 3 that I'm going to speak about were character-based, principle-based, and consequence-based. Okay, next slide. And so for character-based, again, what matters here is the kind of virtues that are important for engineers. And so when you look for those sort of virtues in the code, the ones that you see listed here come readily apparent. And so the idea that we ought to be honest, so the expressing professional opinions truthfully, that sort of idea that we ought to be an honest person is sort of in the code of ethics in various places. The idea of being incorruptible, so this language of 0 tolerance for bribery shows up, and it seems to imply that it's important for engineers to be incorruptible. Now, one of the ones I like a lot that changed was this emphasis on being proficient. Now, I think it's the hallmark of a good engineer that they know what they're talking about. They've got their math down. The engineering concepts are readily understood and well applied, and so on. That part, the technical part, is very, very important to engineers. But what this new code of ethics is saying is to continue professional development to enhance technical and non-technical competencies. So this is acknowledging that there's more to it than knowing the math and knowing all the forces and so on. And I would count this presentation here as one of those non-technical ones where we talk about something a little bit different than polynomials and so on. So that's very, very nice. The other one I think is cool is the one that we ought to be caring people. We want to improve. So 1B, for example, enhancing the quality of life for humanity. 3E, the idea of promoting mentorship and knowledge sharing, equitability with current and future engineers. So we ought to be caring people, care for the future of the profession. And last but not least, Aristotle had an awful lot to say about courage. And so here in the Code of Ethics, you see places where engineers ought to be courageous. And so for that 1I and 5I, both of those have to do with reporting misconduct. So on the one hand, you're reporting misconduct to local authorities. when you see something untoward. And then the last one, 5I, has to do with reporting violations of the Code of Ethics to ASCE. And both of those take quite a bit of courage. 4D is the one that has to do with speaking truth to power. So when you have a committee or a team, and maybe the person who's leading the team is not an engineer and is making a decision that would affect the health and welfare of the public, you should have the courage to stand up and say, this is the result of the decision that you're making. So that takes courage. Okay. Now the next one, for deontological ethics, for principle-based ethics, I think the very preamble is very Kantian. The concept of being governed by fundamental principles has that sort of language. And by the way, so when Dr. Starrett said about how scrupulous they were about using the right words, and sometimes they debated specific words, the wording of whether we should be governed by fundamental principles was one of those things that went back and forth. But again, that's quite Kantian in nature. The idea that we have the prime directive, that we have the one principle that trumps all the other ones, 1A, also is very duty-based. And then it's interesting that stakeholders 4 and 5 are duties that we have towards other people. In essence, we have them to our clients and employers and our peers. So these are duties towards others. And last but not least, the language that was added to the previous Code of Ethics in 2017, the respect for persons, that's also quite Kantian in origin. He termed it, or he called something the practical imperative. The practical imperative is this concept of treating people as ends in themselves and not merely as means to an end. And so that shows up everywhere. It shows up in the preamble as the fundamental principle number 2, and it shows up under various ethical responsibilities with the language of treating people with respect and so on. And then on the other end, the other side of the triangle, you have the consequentialist view. So this idea is that what matters is what is it that we strive for, what is it that we're wanting to do, what are the results of our profession. And so there you see things like wording like safe, resilient, sustainable structures, the idea that we ought to consider and anticipate the needs of society, improve the quality of life. So when you think about utilitarian calculations, the mantra that we use is the greatest good for the greatest number. And so here we are looking for increasing or improving the needs of society, but also improving the quality of life. And so you see that shows up in various parts of the code. Stakeholder number 2 is the one where it brings the language of sustainable development into the code by way of that triple bottom line, which, as you remember, was just to think about the engineering profession as not only being profitable, but also keeping an eye towards being environmentally responsible, and responsibility also to be socially equitable.
There are over 4,000 religions around the globe that people believe in. I am part of the Christian faith community, and Christianity is the only religion I know. So I'm just going to provide an example of how religion can serve to inform ethical related decisions. The Christian faith is rooted in the belief that God cares for and loves each one of us. And the Christian principles give me the reasons why I should pursue honesty, high quality work, to place the needs of others ahead of my own, to have the courage to state my objections when the safety, health, and welfare of the public are unreasonably threatened. So I have found my Christian faith to be very supportive of the concepts that's presented in the Code of Ethics. Dr. Bertha and I authored a real world case studies book in 2017. Yes. And we've got about 3 cases per each of the last canons. This was written under the old Code of Ethics. We all know engineers face lots and lots of ethical dilemmas I've heard of probably over 1,000 ethical dilemmas that engineers have told me about and students have. And so we authored that book, and we implemented the ideas out of each of the concepts that's in the Code of Ethics. And so I think this Code of Ethics can be really valuable to our profession for an educational tool. It can be utilized by engineers that face ethical dilemmas. They can pull out that Code of Ethics, they can read it and consider it. They can work with their teams. I've known of several engineers that at the beginning of a project, they'll get the Code of Ethics out, they'll go through it as a refresher to think about. And so there's just lots of ways that this Code of Ethics can be valuable to our profession. I was impressed with the process that was used. There were thousands of comments that were considered. Those 5 new aspects were added, which I think were quite good and quite timely. Being sure to consider the emerging technologies, the implications of emerging technologies is really important. I remember that the director of the patent office in like 1870 stated that we should just close the patent office. There's no more inventions that were going to happen. And so he was so far off what reality is, and we are such a fast-paced profession now, certainly considering all the artificial intelligence and machine learning and all the smart aspects. Is just incorporating all of the engineering professions. And so that is a very timely addition to our Code of Ethics. There are a couple others here that are new, fostering safety and health in the workplace, being sure to educate the public on the role of civil engineering. Those are excellent. I do have a challenge with the statement on following all the legal requirements. I think almost all the time that lines up perfectly well. As a previous participant stated, our ethics really are developed and are core and they're meaningful. They're developed first, and then the laws come out of our ethical standards. That's how a participant recently described it. And so they don't always match up all the time. I'm sure each of us could find some really old, out-of-date laws that were still in place for our counties and for our states that just didn't make any sense in our current time. I've also been aware of a few situations that the authorities were making unethical decisions. And so if the engineers were meeting the obligation of the legal requirements, they may be able to pass it off and say, yes, I've done my duty, even though the safety of the public was threatened. So most of the time, perfectly fine, but there is sometimes that the ethics, I think, should trump the legal requirements. I also do not agree with the footnote. In fact, I strongly disagree with it, actually, to be honest. So I think this is our standard of care. This was developed by engineers. I've served as an expert witness in a couple dozen legal cases and disputes. This is the best way to define the standard of care. It was based on previous work of generations. It was studied for 2 years, very extensively, written down, approved upon, and I think we are the best group. Engineers are the best group to create a code of ethics for how we want to conduct ourselves ethically.
All right, and so I do think that it's a improvement from the previous one. The previous one, what we showed you was the 8 canons. There was sort of an attached document that went into more detail in each of the canons. And when you compare those two together and what you have today, today's is more streamlined. The language is more up to date, more clear. And so I think it is an improvement. I do think that it serves well for what I call the middle theory. So the connecting for those who to teach philosophy or teach ethics from the perspective of these moral theories. I think it does a good job at connecting the theory with the practice. I do have a couple of items that I also disagree with. I actually take, I don't think that it's a good idea to explicitly rank order the stakeholders. I think that generally speaking, the rank order is correct, but there might be situations where one of the lower ranked stakeholders, the impact is so great that it perhaps might become more important than one that's above. I could think maybe something that affects a peer more so than it affects an employer or a client. And so if you were to go strictly with the wording of the Code of Ethics, you'd have to go with what impacts the employer first. But that might sort of tug at your intuitions about what would be the right thing to do in that case. So I think that I would have preferred if there were some sort of language to the effect that judgment ought to have been used or ought to be used when these stakeholders result or in decisions that go against one another. And so again, I think that that establishing or determining that this is the correct order, that part could have been done better. And then I also disagree with the footnote. From my perspective, one of the things that just looked odd about the whole thing is that it appeared in the very last draft. And so it to me, it just sort of came out of nowhere. And it was a pretty significant thing to add to be done so last minute like that. But I agree with my colleague about the standard of care, that's something that the profession itself ought to be able to establish and to police, and to have a footnote that explicitly says that this is not the standard of care, I think actually sends the bad message. It almost sounds like, well, don't hold us to this because this is not our standard of care. And I think that's the wrong message to send. And with that, here are our individual email addresses. I'm happy to entertain any questions offline, but we have a few minutes where we can still entertain questions here live.
Thank you both for wonderful, really helpful presentation. And I will mention, this was a gift to me from Dr. Starrett, who visited me when I was at NAE. It's great. I recommend it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so there are 9 questions so far in the chat. Let's start with the earliest one posted from Yana Rosales, and it's asked, I'm curious whether other societies and professional engineering associations are similarly reconsidering their codes of ethics. And one of our participants may actually know the answer to that question, so put it in the chat, but I present it to the two of you in case you know.
I'm not aware of, I'm not aware of major changes. I'm just not aware of what IEEE, ASME are pursuing.
Yeah, I am not either. And it was worth noting that, and I think I saw a comment to the effect that the previous one lasted for 43 years. It's almost like, well, it's high time that we've done something to update the language to bring it more up to par. And when the committee first got together, one of the first questions that they asked themselves is whether they want to rewrite the Code of Ethics altogether, or whether they just want to tweak it a little bit and produce kind of a new version. And the committee decided to go with the complete rewriting of the whole thing.
All right, thank you. And someone just put in the chat, what was that book you held up? This is the book that Dr. Starrett referred to, Engineering Ethics, Real World Studies. And it is primarily civil engineering cases, but very helpful. I think aligned with these new codes, correct?
So the book came out in 2017, which was kind of a double whammy for us, because on the one hand, it is the previous Code of Ethics, but it doesn't even contain the latest canon, which was the Treat People Fairly canon. And so when we saw that one coming out, we toyed with the idea of updating the book to accommodate that new canon, but then we were told, well, wait a minute, there's going to be a rewriting of the entire Code of Ethics, and so now we're considering updating the entire book to fit the new Code of Ethics.
Let us know, and we'll put a note in the OEC when that's ready to be announced. Thank you. And then the next question from Ralph Stewart: is there any coordination of these ethical ideas with those of other engineering specialties such as mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, Many projects require interdisciplinary partnerships. Another tough one, huh? Yeah.
Yes, Good question. So I'm not sure I can address, if I understand the question right, as far as the connections with the associated committees with IEEE, ASME. I don't think there were partnerships with those in this particular way, but maybe I'm not understanding the question very well.
I think that was the question. And I am noticing in the chat, someone, Dave Sukup says, I serve as staff support for the ASME Ethics Committee. There are no immediate plans as to do an extensive study as ASCE did. But maybe David would like to connect with you around, the question of how do you bring interdisciplinary work in an alignment with all the various codes? I think that's the nature of the question that we just had. Thank you. From William Kelly, how would you interpret footnote 11? I practice, and can you give an example? 11, let's see, footnote 1, I think that's what he's asking for. How would you interpret footnote?
Well, the footnote was stating that this is not the standard of care. So I wonder if he's referring to that.
Possibly. Please repost your question for clarity, and I'll come back around. Okay, so let's go to Caitlin Wiley. She says, protect and advance, in quotes. Protect and advance is very different from protect. I hear you that this is an aspirational statement, but I think it is more powerful than that. How can the ASCE community support and enforce engineers' responsibility to pursue social improvement and social justice?
Wow. Well, yes. Yeah, that was the intent of the preamble, was to have language that was more aspirational. In fact, the way that the attorney in the committee, her name is Tara Hoke, the way that she put it was that the items that were described in the preamble were not enforceable, and so that's what she said. And the other was the rest of them, under the stakeholders and the ethical responsibilities there, are the ones that are enforceable, in the sense that if you see somebody violating, then the very last ethical responsibility is to report that violation to ASCE. Now, having said that, yeah, I think that the concept of the fact that our profession is interested not only in being profitable, but also in being environmentally conscious and social, having social equity or social justice, that's important. It's important that we continue to consider those things in what we do. So I'm not sure that answers the question. I think that the idea is to maintain that language in the code so that we know that those are things that are valuable to our professions.
All right, thank you. Ralph Stewart asked, does the concept of standard of care have legal ramifications?
Yes, standard of care is often used in courtroom debates, legal disputes. The cases I've been involved with and have served as an expert there, the attorneys are trying to establish a standard of care. It's determined by the judge and the jury for that particular case and that particular situation. I've brought in codes of ethics before when there was discussions about the ethical conduct of engineers. And so it's a very, very legalized, very legal term, the standard of care.
Thank you. There is a hand raised by a participant named Susan Starrett. Susan, I don't know that we can actually hear you. I don't think we have the capacity to do that. Could you put your comment or question in the Q&A, please? Thank you. Okay, she says okay. All righty. And so let's move to Karen Chow, who asks, it appears that the code of ethics only applies to the engineers. What is the code of ethics for professors or the teaching profession? For example, grade inflation does not enforce honesty policy. It is especially tough for engineering faculty who are also professional engineers.
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, yes. So, yeah, this is the American Society of Civil Engineers Code of Ethics, and so this really applies to members of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Now, I'm neither a civil engineer I'm a former mechanical engineer, but I teach philosophy, and I am a member of ASCE. We've done so many of these. We've been to so many conferences and so on that I decided that it was just the right thing to do to become a member. And so, insofar as I'm a member, it does apply to me, all these various ethical responsibilities. But I think that one of the things that's hard to connect is that if you are if you are found in violation of the code, the ASCE does have a number of options of what to do in that particular case. They can admonish you. They can do certain things that would be uncomfortable, including removing you from membership of the profession of the ASCE. And that can carry quite a bit of repercussions. If you work for a company and you have to explain to them why you're not a member of ASCE, that might be problematic. Did you want to add to that, Steve?
That's well said.
Thank you both. Just to let you know, we have 4 minutes left and 6 questions, and I think I would hope to get to the 6 questions. So Bill Kelly wrote back again, William Kelly, I'm not sure if you're Bill Kelly or not. Sorry, how would you interpret footnote 1, and can you give an example?
So Steve, do you want to give an example of that?
Yep, sure. So I think there's going to be a defense attorney would utilize that, and when this code of ethics would be presented by the lawsuit, and a defense attorney for an engineering firm would bring it up and say, it says right here, the footnote, that this is not the standard of care. And so I think the defense attorney would try to utilize it and have it dismissed. Does that make sense, Dr. Bertha?
Yes, yeah, no, exactly. That's I think one of the reasons why I'm against the footnote as well, because it almost seems exculpatory, like, well, don't hold us to this. Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah Faddichter asks, one of the challenges of an aspirational code is enforcement. How does one criticize another for not fully meeting what all are striving toward? I'm curious what you think about the role of enforcement with this new code, and thanks for a great presentation.
Well, I can speak for the first one. Good. Yes, it's very difficult to hold people accountable for an aspirational term, a lofty idea like this. But I think Dr. Starrett can comment on that last part about the violation, whether or not that's going to increase or not, how many people are reported as violating.
There's a couple dozen violation reports each year to the Professional Conduct Committee. It will be interesting to see, now that it's part of the Code of Ethics, if that increases or if it stays the same. And so we'll know as the years go by.
All right, let's try. I don't know if we'll get through, but let's try. An anonymous attendee writes, the stereotype of engineers is that they often place clients and employers and profession higher than society and the environment. I think the move to reprioritize this, I like the move. However, is there a risk of practitioners taking it less to heart if they see it as out of touch with their perceived day-to-day responsibilities? Note, I agree with the ranking, but wondering if that was part of the discussion.
Yeah, so when I brought up the question of ranking, the response was that the committee felt that they needed to be more guiding, for the guiding to be more clear. And I can kind of see it there. We had a participant only last week who said, I very much appreciate that it's ranked, ordered in this way. And so in that case, she was very much in favor of that. And again, I generally am in favor of the ranking. It's just that I think that there could be situations that come up against our intuitions about what we should do. There may be few and far between, very much like the legal issue that Dr. Starrett mentioned.
Thank you for all the Q&A. Thank you for the participants being with us. What a wonderful, robust conversation. And I thank you both, Dr. Starrett, Dr. Bertha. I believe others are saying the same in the chat. Thank you so much. We are just about at the end of time. Please join the Online Ethics Center if you're not already a member, www.onlineethics.org. There'll be more presentations to come. We are grateful for both of you, Dr. Bertha and Dr. Starrett. It's an important topic. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for being with us.